The Epistle to the Romans, penned by the Apostle Paul, is a cornerstone of Christian theology, and its first 3 chapters lay a critical foundation for understanding the gospel from a dispensational perspective. Dispensationalism, a theological framework that divides biblical history into distinct periods or dispensations, where God interacts with humanity in unique ways, interprets Romans 1-3 as a transition from the dispensation of the law to the dispensation of grace. These chapters systematically demonstrate the universal sinfulness of both Jews and Gentiles, the failure of previous dispensations, and the revelation of God's righteousness through faith in Jesus Christ, which is central to the current age. Romans chapter 1. The gospel of grace and the condemnation of the Gentiles. In Romans 1, Paul introduces himself as an apostle set apart for the gospel of God, Romans 1:1, which dispensational scholars like E.W. Bullinger identify as the gospel of the grace of God. Bullinger's notes, "This gospel is distinct from the gospel of the kingdom preached by Jesus and the 12 apostles during his earthly ministry, which focused on the imminent kingdom for Israel. Paul's gospel, by contrast, emphasizes salvation by grace through faith for all nations, aligning with the current dispensation. He declares that this gospel is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek." Romans 1:16, reflecting the transitional nature of the Acts period where Israel still held a privileged position. 8a. Ironside notes that Paul's apostleship is uniquely directed toward the Gentiles, differing from the 12 apostles' ministry linked to the kingdom and the family of God. Ironside's notes, Paul then turns to the Gentile world, describing their rejection of God's revelation through creation, leading to idolatry and moral degradation. Romans 1:18-32. This vivid portrayal underscores the universal need for redemption, as the Gentiles, under the dispensation of conscience, suppressed the truth and incurred God's wrath. Dispensationalists highlight that during the Acts period, Paul could impart spiritual gifts to establish believers. Romans 1:11, a practice not applicable today, further situating Romans within a transitional dispensation. Romans chapter 2. God's impartial judgment and the failure of law and conscience. In Romans 2, Paul addresses both Jews and Gentiles, emphasizing that God's judgment is impartial, based on truth and deeds, and without partiality. Romans 2:11. He warns against hypocrisy, noting that those who judge others while committing the same sins are inexcusable. Romans 2:1. For the Jews who possess the law and boast in their circumcision, Paul asserts that their failure to obey the law renders their circumcision meaningless. Romans 2:25. Conversely, Gentiles who instinctively fulfill the law's requirements demonstrate that the law is written on their hearts, pointing to a future new covenant reality. Romans 2:15. Dispensationalists interpret this chapter as highlighting the failure of humanity under different dispensations. The Jews, under the dispensation of the law, had the advantage of divine revelation, but failed to live up to it, while the Gentiles, under the dispensation of conscience, also fell short, despite the light of nature and conscience. Ironside's notes. Ironside emphasizes that greater privileges, such as the Jews' possession of the law, increase responsibility, and God's judgment will be according to the light received. This universal failure underscores the need for a new means of righteousness, as neither law nor conscience can justify humanity before God. Romans chapter 3. Universal sin and the revelation of righteousness through faith. Romans 3 begins by acknowledging the advantages of the Jews, particularly their possession of the oracles of God. Romans 3:2, which gave them a unique role in God's redemptive plan during the Acts period. However, Paul quickly establishes that both Jews and Gentiles are under sin, quoting a series of Old Testament passages to demonstrate that there is none righteous, no, not one. Romans 3:10. The law, given primarily to Israel, serves to reveal sin rather than justify, leaving all humanity guilty before God. Romans 3:19-20. The pivotal moment comes with the phrase, "but now," in Romans 3:21, which dispensationalists view as a marker of a dispensational shift. Paul declares that the righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law, being witnessed by the law and the prophets. Romans 3:21. This righteousness is available through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe, without distinction between Jew and Gentile. Ironside highlights that this shift introduces justification by grace through faith, with Christ's death as the propitiation that settles the sin question. Ironside's notes, the gospel of grace unifies all believers under one plan of salvation, fulfilling the mystery revealed through Paul, that Gentiles are now joint heirs with Jews. Ephesians 3:6. Dispensational distinctives in Romans 1-3. Dispensational theology emphasizes several key distinctives in these chapters. 1. Paul's unique ministry. Paul's apostleship to the Gentiles is seen as part of the dispensation of the mystery, distinct from the ministry of the 12 apostles to Israel. This is evident in his focus on the gospel of grace and his role in imparting spiritual gifts during the Acts period. 2. Transitional nature of the Acts period. The priority given to the Jew first, Romans 1:16, and the Jew's advantage in possessing the oracles of God, Romans 3, reflect the transitional period before the full revelation of the mystery, where Israel still held a distinct role. Shift to the dispensation of grace. The "but now" in Romans 3:21 marks the introduction of the current dispensation, where salvation is by faith alone, apart from the works of the law, and available to all without distinction. You may pause the video and have a look at the following table. Romans 1-3, from a dispensational perspective, serves as a theological bridge between the dispensations of law and grace. Paul meticulously demonstrates the universal sinfulness of humanity, the inadequacy of previous dispensations to produce righteousness, and the glorious revelation of God's righteousness through faith in Jesus Christ. The transitional elements, such as the priority given to the Jews and Paul's unique ministry, situate these chapters within the Acts period, while the introduction of the gospel of grace points to the current age. This exposition not only establishes the need for salvation, but also unveils God's gracious provision, making Romans 1-3 a cornerstone of dispensational theology.